All right, with lecture number 7, we are going to get into the Articles of Confederation and the Constitutional Convention. From 1776 through roughly 1787, the new nation had operated under a government laid out in what was known as the Articles of Confederation. You might remember last time I highlighted the Articles as one of our 4 great founding documents. Supporters of this short-lived experiment pointed to 3 distinct accomplishments of the Confederation government. First, this is the government that won the war with Great Britain. No small feat. This is the government, second, that won the peace, signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, ending the Revolutionary War. And third, the Confederation government created the Northwest Territory. 3 major accomplishments. Unfortunately, detractors were able to point to even more weaknesses inherent in this form of government. The most distinctive feature or weakness of this government was its weak executive, and that was actually by design. This branch of government was made intentionally weak because of the founders' experience with George III, someone they had called a tyrant and a despot. They didn't want to create a tyrant or a despot to head the new nation. The national government had limited taxation powers. That's a further weakness. In fact, the only revenues brought into the national treasury were those duties paid on imports and exports, and whatever the national government could requisition from the states. This left the fledgling government in a constant state of near bankruptcy. Very, very hard to run an effective government without consistent funding. Third, the Confederation government also had limited power to conduct diplomacy on behalf of all the states. As a result, individual states were left to negotiate with their European trading partners. So imagine a scenario where New York signs a treaty with Belgium, and Georgia signs a treaty with France, and Massachusetts signs a treaty with Great Britain. Diplomacy was total chaos under the Confederation government. Finally, all of this government's actions were subject to the veto power of any of the 13 states. Again, imagine a scenario where 12 states acting in unison, very desirous of passing a piece of legislation, little Rhode Island could come along and utilize their veto to stop that legislation cold. Not a very effective system. Because of these weaknesses, suffice it to say that the Confederation government was a government without teeth at the national level. As a result, by the mid-1780s, the country was in serious crisis. In an effort to address this crisis and revise the Articles, representatives from several states met at Annapolis in the summer of 1786. They came with a very limited goal. That limited goal was to try to come up with a national plan on regulating trade. Even in this limited area, they were unable to come to an agreement. At the close of the Annapolis Convention, the delegates discussed the possibility of calling a constitutional convention the following summer. Congress did just that, asking each state to send representatives to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Still, there was little expectation that the Philadelphia Convention would fare any better than the Annapolis Convention had. That changed when the need for a convention was given greater urgency by the outbreak of rebellion in western Massachusetts. Looking for tax relief, monetary reform, and military back pay owed by the state government, a number of veterans in western Massachusetts rebelled under a man by the name of Daniel Shays. This happens in the winter of 1786-87. The Shays Rebellion was eventually put down by the Massachusetts militia, but not before causing many around the country to believe that the national government must be strengthened in order to deal with this sort of threat. Without the Shays Rebellion as a proximate cause of real anxiety around the country, the Constitutional Convention would almost surely not have happened in the summer of 1787. Nevertheless, it did. And when that Constitutional Convention was convened in the spring of 1787, the original states, with the exception of Rhode Island, collectively appointed 74 individuals to meet in Philadelphia. Now, a number of those selected did not accept or couldn't attend. Some chose not to attend for financial reasons. Many had lost significant fortunes during the war. Others chose not to attend for political or ideological reasons. It's important at this point to understand that the country, and even the founders, had become divided into two large groups that held differing opinions on the need for a constitutional convention. The historian Larry Schweikert calls these two groups the two streams of liberty. And here we're talking about the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists, with leaders like Sam Adams and Patrick Henry, were sympathetic to what they called the Spirit of 76. They believed the Articles of Confederation laid out a good system. They liked that it protected the sovereignty of the states against centralized power. Their greatest fear was the consolidation of power in a centralized authority. The Anti-Federalists were very suspicious of the motives of those who had called for the Constitutional Convention. Now, Federalist, or sometimes called nationalist leaders, these are men like Washington and Hamilton, Franklin and Madison, they believed that the national government had to be strengthened or it would continue to flounder. The Federalists pointed to the Confederation's inability to supply the Continental Army during the war. These leaders, Madison especially, thought that more power had to be ceded to the states by the national government. Ceded by the states to the national government in order for the nation to reach its full potential. They looked to broaden the power of the federal government to tax and to regulate commerce. They saw what they believed to be the huge economic potential of the United States. When the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention were chosen, very few of the anti-Federalist persuasion chose to attend. Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry did not go to Philadelphia. Patrick Henry was asked by a member of the press why he wasn't attending, and he famously said, "Because I smell a rat." In choosing not to attend, the Anti-Federalists largely ceded the convention to the Federalist point of view. Now, let's take a closer look at the actual makeup of the group that met in the spring and summer of 1787. Of those who did attend, the delegates ranged in age from Jonathan Dayton, who was only 26, up to Benjamin Franklin, who was 81. Benjamin Franklin had been the oldest member of the Second Continental Congress when they met 11 years earlier. And again, he's the senior member of this group that meets in Philadelphia. By this time, at age 81, Franklin suffered from kidney stones and gallstones, gout, and a number of other maladies that made it almost impossible for him to walk on the cobblestone streets to Independence Hall. As a result, Franklin was taken every morning. They got 4 prisoners out of the local jail, and they put Franklin in a sedan chair. Picture an overstuffed chair mounted on 2 poles. Those 4 prisoners would put those poles up on their shoulders, and they'd take Franklin through the streets from his home to Independence Hall. And if you know anything about the personality of Benjamin Franklin, you can imagine what that procession looked like. He was waving and kissing babies and probably signing a few autographs as well. Now, the average age of those who attended the Constitutional Convention was just 42. So this is a fairly young group. 39 of the delegates, of the 55 delegates who attended that summer, 39 had served in Congress at one time or another. So there's a lot of legislative experience in this group. 8 of the 55 had worked in state constitutional conventions. So when the state constitutions are rewritten, there are 8 members who participate in that, and that experience is going to be invaluable as they decide to rewrite the U.S. Constitution. 7 of the 55 who attended that summer had been state governors, and their executive experience is going to be very important. Much like the makeup of Congress today, the majority of those in attendance, 34 of the 55, were lawyers by training. So they're going to have the legal experience needed to draw up this very important document. Fully 1/3 of the 55 who attended were veterans of the Continental Army, veterans of the war against Great Britain. Nearly all of those who attended were gentlemen, what Thomas Jefferson would call natural aristocrats. They took their political superiority for granted as the inevitable consequence of their social and economic position. These are the leaders of their communities, and they're chosen to recreate the nation in the summer of 1787. Now, while some were still wealthy, many had lost a great deal during the war and the ensuing bad economy. Some had to borrow money to attend the convention. The last group that's represented among those 55 delegates are the gentlemen who are either slave owners or they work on slave plantations. 12 of the 55 either own slaves or manage slave-operated plantations. That's going to be a very important group. It's a minority, but it's a very important minority. And those at the convention are going to have to try to figure out, how do we create a document that's going to be palatable by enough of those 12 where we can claim legitimacy? Very, very important group. All throughout the summer, members would come and go. So there were rarely more than 30 to 35 members in attendance on any given day. So there are 55 men who participate, but again, no more than about 30 or 35 on any given day. This group meets in the same room in Independence Hall, where 11 years earlier, the Second Continental Congress had authorized and signed the Declaration of Independence. The delegates at this convention, however, had one advantage over those who had met 11 years previously. Independence from Great Britain was already a fact. They didn't have to explain why the break with Great Britain was necessary. As a result, they could focus on the task at hand. But the question was, what was that task? Were they in Philadelphia simply to fine-tune the existing government, or were they there to create something entirely new? If so, if they were to create something entirely new, this went way beyond the charge they'd been given by the people of their states when they had been chosen. The issue of whether they were there to tinker with the articles or begin anew was decided shortly after the convention commenced. And the consensus was to create an entirely new system of government. However, once this monumental decision was made, the question was, where do we go from here? Into that vacuum stepped probably the most important member of this body, James Madison. And he steps in with what are called the Virginia Resolves. The Resolves gave the delegates a framework for moving forward. It was a plan of government that Madison had developed. Madison had prepared the Resolves after arriving 10 days prior to any of the other delegates in order to study the history of Republican government. Thomas Jefferson, who had been so important 11 years earlier in drafting the Declaration, wasn't even there at the Constitutional Convention. Madison's best friend was in France, acting as our representative to that European nation. So when Madison is called to Philadelphia, he immediately writes to his best friend, Thomas Jefferson, and says, send me everything you can find on the history of Republican government. I want to know about Republican government in Greece, Republican government in Rome, Republican government in Switzerland. And Jefferson did just that. Jefferson collected books, put them in a trunk, and shipped them to James Madison. When Madison arrived, as I said, 10 days early, he spent 18 hours a day studying the history of Republican government. Where did they succeed? Where did they fail? What were their strengths? What were their weaknesses? So again, when the decision is made that they're going to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, they're going to create something entirely new, James Madison was prepared, and he had the Virginia Resolves to offer. As the delegates set their course, they realized that there was one general issue and two specific issues that they were going to have to deal with. The general issue was how strong to make the new national government. Remember, these founders had an experience with George III where they were fearful of executive power. They had called the king a tyrant and a despot. They didn't want to make this federal government too consolidated in terms of power in one individual. Many of the delegates, the Federalists especially, believed that a strong national government was essential to bring together 13 disparate states. However, their recent experience, as I said, with despotism, told them that strong centralized government could be the ruin of the new republic. So that's the general issue they have to deal with. The two specific issues are representation, how are people and states going to be represented, and the other issue is slavery. And we're going to pick up with representation in lecture number 8. Thanks.